A black woman with copper-toned long extensions and a lethal, athletic build stood before the most powerful crime boss in South Korea. Kadae wore an all-black ensemble, a cropped leather hooded jacket and a tactical turtleneck, marking her as a professional cleaner in a room full of suits. One guard spat on the polished floor near her combat boots. Another whispered that Hyungnim's desperation had finally reached a pathetic new low. Kadae heard every word. She understood every insult. She filed every face away for later, her expression a mask of deadly calm. When the hiring manager demanded her credentials, she didn't hand over a folder. Instead, she slid a single photograph across the obsidian desk. It showed a fortified military black site in Libya, or what was left of it. The compound was reduced to rubble, flames still licking the ruins, bodies scattered like broken toys. 47 guards, Kadae said, her voice a cold, clinical rasp. I walked out. They did not. She met Hyungnim's eyes, ignoring the traditional Irizumi tattoos that climbed his neck like war paint. My resume is the body count I left behind. My credentials are classified by governments that deny my existence. You do not hire me because you trust me. You hire me because I am the last option before your funeral. 10 hours later, 73 professional killers would lie broken across the estate grounds. Mercenaries, yakuza, and Spectre operatives, all sent to claim the $25 million bounty. By sunrise, every single one would be defeated by the woman they had mocked. If you believe extraordinary talent comes from unexpected places, pay close attention. Only those who judge books by their covers would overlook the ghost standing in the room. Hyungnim had built the Iron Dragon Syndicate through blood and brilliance. He was a man of immovable power, a stoic anchor in a world of chaos. From the shipping routes of Incheon to the high-stakes crypto exchanges of Seoul, his name inspired a silent, terrifying respect. For decades, he had outmaneuvered rivals and eliminated threats with surgical precision. But now, the hunter had become the hunted. It began with whispers of a $25 million bounty. Then came the reality, a car bomb that missed him by seconds and a sniper's round that shattered his window. The final blow was the most personal. His head of security, a man who had served him for nearly 2 decades, was found staged as a suicide. Carved into the man's chest was a message that acted as a death knell. Full moon. Your last. Hyungnim knew the date. It was exactly 10 hours away. 10 hours to find a shield in a city where his own family had turned into snakes. 10 hours before the most powerful criminal organizations in Asia would unleash their best to claim his head. Desperation makes men do strange things. It made Hyungnim, a man steeped in tradition and executive discipline, consider the unthinkable, trusting his life to an American veteran who looked at the world with a deadly calm gaze. As he walked forward with a deliberate, confident pace, he didn't look at the fires or the bodies already beginning to pile up. He looked straight ahead at his goal, trusting the woman whose arm crossed his chest like a living barrier. He represented the old power. She was the new force. Together, they were about to show the underworld that the full moon didn't belong to the assassins. It belonged to the ghost. The neon signs of Seoul's Mapo district hummed with a restless, electric energy, their blue and pink hues flickering against the damp pavement of a midnight drizzle. It was the kind of night where the air felt heavy, saturated with the smell of wet asphalt, ozone, and the distant, savory steam of street food stalls. Inside a cramped 24-hour convenience store, the atmosphere was starkly different. Sterile, brightly lit by buzzing fluorescent tubes, and smelling faintly of industrial floor wax and overboiled coffee that had been sitting on the burner since dusk. Kadae stood at the back of the store, a shadow amongst the brightly packaged snacks. Her copper-toned natural curls caught the harsh overhead light, a bold crown that matched the quiet intensity in her eyes. She wore a black, cropped leather hooded jacket over a dark turtleneck, an ensemble that made her blend into the corners of the room. Her fingers grazed a cold bottle of water in the refrigerated case, the condensation chilling her skin. She was a woman who moved through the world with a deadly calm, a ghost in a city of 10 million, looking for nothing more than a moment of anonymity. The bell above the door didn't just chime, it screamed. 3 men burst in, the door hitting the stopper with a violent crack. They wore cheap nylon masks, but their eyes betrayed them. They had the jagged, amateurish confidence of street thugs who believed a weapon made them invincible. One, a wire-thin youth with nervous hands, leveled a sawed-off shotgun at the trembling clerk. The other two, carrying canvas duffels, began ransacking the registers, their movements frantic and loud. In the back corner, tucked away in the shadows of the snack aisle, sat a man who didn't belong in a place like this. He was sipping a tea that had long since gone cold, his sharp, charcoal-grey suit looking entirely out of place against the backdrop of instant ramen. This was Hyungnim's primary advisor, a man whose job was to see the things others missed. His eyes narrowed, not in fear, but in clinical assessment. He lived in a world of professional violence, and he could tell these boys were the most dangerous kind of threat, the kind that was sloppy, desperate, and prone to twitchy fingers. Kade didn't freeze. She didn't reach for a weapon she didn't have. Instead, she let go of the water bottle and stepped into the light. The thug with the shotgun spun around, a sneer forming beneath his mask. He saw a woman, an outsider, a foreigner whose very presence felt like an insult to his temporary kingdom. He leveled the heavy barrel at her chest, screaming a string of profanities, demanding she get on the ground. Kade didn't drop. She didn't plead. She moved before the sound of his voice had even faded from the air. It wasn't a movie-style flourish. There were no cinematic spins or wasted breaths. It was economical violence, the kind taught in rooms without windows. In one fluid motion, her left hand snapped upward, redirecting the shotgun's barrel toward the ceiling just as the thug's finger tightened on the trigger. The blast shattered a fluorescent light, raining sparks and glass, but by then, Kade's right palm had already driven upward into the man's chin. The sickening sound of teeth clicking together preceded the dull thud of his head hitting the linoleum. 22 seconds. That was the total duration of the engagement. By the time the second thug reached for a serrated knife at his belt, Kade had already used the first man's falling momentum to sweep the second's legs out from under him. He hit the floor hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. The third man, the one at the register, didn't even get a chance to flee. She met him mid-stride as he tried to bolt for the door, delivering a clinical strike to the throat that left him gasping for air he couldn't find. She didn't stay to be thanked by the sobbing clerk or to answer the questions she saw forming in the advisor's eyes. She calmly picked up her water bottle, tossed a handful of one on the counter to cover the mess, and walked out into the rain. The advisor watched her go, his tea still held in a steady hand. He realized he hadn't just seen a fight, he had witnessed a masterclass in survival. He didn't see a woman, he saw a ghost, a weapon of precision that could fix the impossible situation currently swallowing his boss whole. The obsidian desk in Hyungnim's private study felt like a tombstone. The room was silent, save for the low hum of an air purifier and the rhythmic ticking of a grandfather clock that had stood in the Park family for 3 generations. For 20 years, Hyungnim, the Iron Dragon, had been the apex predator of the Seoul underworld. He was a man of immovable power, his neck and arms covered in traditional Irezumi tattoos that told the story of 100 battles won. He was the one who dictated the price of life and the cold cost of betrayal. But as he stared at the glowing digital readout on an encrypted dark web forum, the predator felt the cold, suffocating shadow of a cage. $25 million. That was the price for his head. It was a staggering sum, posted by a ghost account linked to a coalition of international syndicates, the Yakuza, the Triads, and even the Bratva. It was a decapitation strike designed to shatter the Iron Dragon Syndicate and redistribute its vast holdings in shipping, construction, and cryptocurrency. It wasn't just the money that chilled the room, it was the terrifying realization that the wall he had built around himself, the wall of loyalty, tradition, and blood, had turned into a sieve. That morning, his armored sedan had been rigged with a mercury switch. Only a last-minute decision to walk through the garden had kept him from being incinerated. 2 hours later, his personal chef, a man who had cooked for Hyungnim's wedding and saw his children born, was found slumped in the pantry. He had been poisoned by the very toxins meant for Hyungnim's morning tea. The security feeds showed nothing. The logs were pristine. The men who stood outside his door in tailored black blazers, carrying submachine guns and wearing the pin of the Iron Dragon, were the same men who had sworn blood oaths to him. Yet, somewhere in that line of loyal soldiers sat a snake. The betrayal was internal, deep, and surgical. Even the government had turned. The National Intelligence Service, NIS, had frozen his legitimate assets without warning, a clear signal that the political winds had shifted in favor of his executioners. He was being liquidated, both financially and physically. When his advisor returned and spoke of the woman in the convenience store, the outsider who moved with the grace of a storm, Hyungnim didn't scoff. He looked at his tattoos in the mirror, symbols of an old world that was currently failing him. The full moon, Hyungnim whispered. It was a deadline set by the assassins, exactly 5 days away. 5 days before the bounty became a free-for-all. He was a man of tradition, a man who valued the executive look and the discipline of the old ways. But he was also a man who wanted to continue breathing. He realized that to survive a modern, asymmetric war, he needed a weapon that didn't care about his tradition. He needed someone who existed outside the circle of betrayal. He needed the ghost. The walk from the main gate of the Park estate to the inner sanctum was a gauntlet of whispers and suppressed rage. The estate was a sprawling fortress of traditional architecture and modern tech, but today, it felt fragile. Cadet marched through the central courtyard, her combat boots echoing against the ancient stone. Her eyes scanned the perimeter with a cold, mechanical detachment, her deadly calm gaze identifying every security camera, every guard's posture, and every potential breach point before she had even reached the front door. She ignored the guards who stood in clusters, their eyes full of a toxic mix of sexism and xenophobia. They saw her long copper extensions and her leather jacket and saw an interloper, a foreigner who had no place in their hallowed halls. "The boss has finally lost his mind," one captain muttered, loud enough for the sound to carry across the yard. "Hiring a woman, a foreigner, to do a man's job. Is this what we've become?" Another guard, a man whose neck was thick with muscle and arrogance, stepped directly into her path. He puffed out his chest, his hand resting provocatively on his holstered sidearm. He looked down at her, a sneer twisting his face, and spat a thick glob of phlegm onto the toe of Cadet's boot. He waited, his muscles tensed, hoping for a reaction, a flinch, an angry word, anything that would allow him to put her in her place. Cadet stopped. She didn't look up at his face. She didn't give him the satisfaction of eye contact. Instead, she looked at his stance. She saw that his weight was back on his heels, his grip on the weapon was too tight, and his ego had made him blind to the fact that his throat was completely exposed. She didn't wipe the boot. She didn't say a word. She simply stepped around him as if he were a piece of discarded furniture, her expression unchanging. She wasn't there to win their respect or to engage in their petty power plays. She was there to audit their failure. Reaching the central security hub, a room filled with state-of-the-art monitors and high-strung technicians, she didn't wait for an introduction. She walked to the main console and began ripping out proprietary fiber-optic cables with a practiced, violent efficiency. "What are you doing?" the lead technician screamed, lunging forward. Cadet caught his wrist mid-air, her grip like a steel vice, and forced him back into his chair without ever breaking her stride. "This system is a joke," she said, her voice cutting through the rising protests like a blade. "Your cameras have blind spots large enough to hide a motorcade. Your internal encryption was cracked by the NIS 3 months ago, and you're currently broadcasting your boss's location to a satellite in low Earth orbit." She turned to the head of security, a man who had protected Hyungnim for 18 years and who now looked ready to draw his weapon in a fit of insulted pride. "You've spent nearly 2 decades building a fortress of ego," Cadet told him, her gaze pinning him to his seat. "You've relied on the fear of your name rather than the reality of your tactics. I have exactly 10 hours before the full moon begins to turn this house from a funeral pyre into a fortress of survival." She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous hum. "If you want to play at being a soldier, stand in the corner and stay out of my way. If you want to live to see the sun, you will do exactly what the foreigner tells you." She didn't wait for his permission. She didn't look for his approval. Cadet turned back to the screens, her fingers dancing across the keyboard as she began to rewrite the estate's digital DNA. She moved through the shadows of the command center like a ghost reclaiming its home, and for the first time in weeks, the air in the house felt like it might actually be possible to survive the night. The audit had begun, and the 73 assassins currently moving through the streets of Seoul had no idea that the noise they expected to encounter had just been replaced by a silent, deadly silence. The air in the grand boardroom was thick, saturated with the metallic scent of unearned confidence and the heavy aroma of high-end scotch. Hyungnim sat at the head of the obsidian table, a figure of immovable power. To any outsider, he looked like a corporate titan in a tailored blazer, but the traditional Irizumi tattoos creeping up the column of his neck told a story of street wars and ruthless ascensions. His eyes, cold and fixed, didn't rest on the documents before him, but on the three men who had called this emergency session. Minsu, Dae-ho, and Kang. They were the old guard, the pillars of the Iron Dragon Syndicate who had bled for the throne but now hungered for its inheritance. They looked at Kade, standing silently by the double mahogany doors, with a mixture of amusement and open contempt. To them, she was a desperate gimmick, a diversity hire by a boss who had lost his nerve. They didn't see the elite operator. They saw a $25 million payout shielded only by a woman in a leather jacket. They believed the bounty was their retirement fund. They were wrong. The tension snapped when Minsu shifted his weight. It was a subtle movement, the kind only a trained eye would catch, the tightening of the shoulder, the shallowing of the breath. He reached into his jacket, his fingers twitching toward a concealed ceramic blade. He thought he was fast. He didn't realize that from the moment Kade had entered the room, she had already mapped its geometry, calculated the weight of the furniture, and identified the fatal flaws in every man's stance. Kade didn't reach for the sidearm holstered at her hip. A gun was too loud, too final for a room that still needed to function. Instead, her hand blurred toward a heavy, sharp-edged crystal paperweight sitting on a side console. The violence that followed was a masterpiece of physics and anatomical precision. Second 1 through 3, the crystal left Kade's hand with the velocity of a pitcher's fastball. It didn't just hit Minsu. It intercepted him. Before his blade had even cleared his inner pocket, the crystal shattered his orbital bone. He went down without a sound, his body collapsing like a marionette with cut strings. Second 4 through 6, Kade didn't wait to watch him fall. She was already in motion, her combat boots silent on the plush carpet. She closed the 10-foot gap with 2 explosive strides. Dae-ho, a man twice her size, began to rise, his mouth opening to shout a warning. He never got the chance. Kade used the momentum of her sprint to drive her elbow into the soft tissue of his throat. The sound of his windpipe collapsing was a sickening, wet crunch. He slumped back into his leather chair, clutching his neck, his face turning a dark, bruised purple. Second 7 through 9. Kang, the most seasoned of the three, finally managed to draw a weapon, but Kade was already behind him. She seized his wrist, twisting his arm into a grotesque, impossible angle that forced a jagged scream from his lungs. With a clinical coldness, she slammed his face downward. The impact with the mahogany table was punctuated by the splash of spilled scotch. Kang lay still, his blood mingling with the 20-year-old malt. 9 seconds. 3 of the syndicate's most feared killers had been neutralized. The remaining peripheral guards froze. Their hands hovered over their holsters, caught in the paralyzing realization that they were outclassed. They stared at Kade, who stood in a stance of deadly calm, her breathing not even elevated. She looked at them not with anger, but with the clinical gaze of a doctor assessing a terminal patient. Hyungnim didn't blink. He didn't even shift in his chair. He simply looked at the wreckage of his inner circle, then looked up at Kade. He saw the ghost he had hired, the shield and the weapon combined. With a slow, deliberate nod, he acknowledged the truth. The purge had officially begun. With the boardroom secured and the traitors dragged out by the few guards still loyal to the throne, Kade didn't pause for a victory lap. Survival was a matter of logistics, not ego. She moved through the estate toward the library, her mind already calculating the next phase of the defense. Hidden behind a false wall of leather-bound classics was the shadow room. To the syndicate, this was just a high-tech server closet. To Kade, it was a crime scene. She stepped inside, the air cooled by high-output fans and humming with the low, steady vibration of military-grade hardware. She sat at the terminal, her fingers flying across a portable deck she had patched into the system. She didn't use the standard logins. She bypassed the biometric locks using backdoors she had learned during her Spectre days, protocols used by agencies that didn't officially exist. The truth began to scroll across her screen in cold, neon green lines of code. The betrayal wasn't just a local power grab by greedy lieutenants. It was a state-sponsored execution. The Korean National Intelligence Service, NIS, wasn't just looking the other way, they were the architects. They had been feeding the estate's real-time security data directly to the international hit teams. Every camera angle, every guard rotation, every thermal signature, and even the frequency of Hyungnim's own heartbeat was being broadcast to a military satellite orbiting 300 miles above the peninsula. Kade felt the familiar, phantom itch at the base of her skull. It was the realization that she was once again fighting a war against an enemy with an infinite budget and the authority of a flag. The NIS had turned the Iron Dragon's own home into a glass house. "They think they're watching a sleeping dragon," she whispered, her face illuminated by the flickering data streams. "But I'm about to turn the lights out." She didn't just cut the feed. That would alert the NIS that they had been made. Instead, she injected a loop script, a sophisticated piece of digital camouflage. To the monitors at the NIS headquarters, the estate would appear perfectly normal. Guards walking their rounds, the lights dimming on schedule, a quiet, empty house. In reality, she was severing their eyes and ears, creating a digital shroud over the compound. The hunter was about to become the blind man in a dark room. The sun began to dip below the horizon, bleeding a deep, bruised crimson across the Seoul skyline. As the light faded, long, jagged shadows stretched across the Iron Dragon estate, turning the manicured gardens into a forest of silhouettes. Kade spent the remaining hours transforming the luxury compound into a tactical nightmare. She didn't use claymores or high explosives. She knew the value of economical violence. Loud noises drew attention, and her goal was to dismantle the assault force before they even knew they were in a fight. She focused on environmental denial. She moved through the marble hallways, her long extensions tied back, her all-black ensemble blending into the deepening gloom. She rigged the floors with high-voltage induction coils hidden beneath the priceless Persian rugs. Anyone stepping on them without the proper insulated footwear, which she had provided to the few loyalists left, would find their nervous system instantly overridden. Next, she moved to the HVAC system. She replaced the standard fire suppression gas with a specialized non-lethal aerosol, a neurosedative that induced immediate vertigo and a loss of motor control. It wouldn't kill, but it would turn the world's elite assassins into stumbling toddlers. The gardens, once a place of zen and tradition, were turned into a labyrinth of kill zones. She didn't rig them to kill, but to disorient. Pressure plates buried under the gravel were linked to high-intensity strobe banks hidden in the shrubbery. These strobes were timed to a specific frequency that would shatter night vision goggles, burning out the retinas of anyone relying on tech to see in the dark. She gathered the remaining guards, the young ones, the ones who hadn't yet been corrupted by Minsu's promises. She didn't give them a rousing speech. She gave them ghost patterns. "Stay in the blind spots," she commanded, her voice like grinding stones. "If you see the light flash, close your eyes. If you hear the hum, stay off the rugs. You are not soldiers tonight. You are ghosts. And ghosts don't die." The estate was no longer a home or a palace of criminal wealth. It was a curated trap, a masterpiece of psychological and physical warfare. Every corner was a question, and every shadow was an answer. As the first silver sliver of the full moon appeared over the city, Kade stepped into the center of the courtyard. The air was cold now, the drizzle of the afternoon replaced by a crisp, biting wind. She checked her sidearm, adjusted her leather jacket, and took a steady firing position. Her face was a mask of deadly calm. She wasn't just waiting for the assassins. She was inviting them. She wanted them to come with their numbers, their high-tech gear, and their arrogance. She wanted to show them that in the 10 hours between dusk and dawn, the $25 million bounty wasn't a prize, it was a death warrant. The 10-hour clock had begun to tick. The Iron Dragon was no longer hiding. With Kade as his shield, he was simply waiting for the world to break itself against his gate. The clock on the security wall flickered to 10:17 p.m., and the world outside the estate's reinforced glass went unnervingly still. Then, the sensors Kade had buried in the perimeter grass spiked. The assault didn't begin with a bang, it began with the soft, metallic thud of grappling hooks catching the stone balconies. The first wave was the expendable talent, Mercenaries from the Black Dragon Syndicate and Triad street soldiers, over 30 men moving with the clumsy speed of those who expected a quick payday. They didn't see Cadet, but she saw them through the heat signature overlays of her visor. She moved through the darkened hallways like a predator in its own cage. As the first team of 6 breached the foyer, the floor beneath them hummed. Cadet triggered the induction coils, and the men collapsed in a silent, twitching heap as the current locked their muscles. She didn't stop to check them. She was already on the second floor, intercepting a squad coming through the skylight. Using a weighted combat line, she snared the lead climber and swung him into his partner, the momentum sending both tumbling back into the darkness of the courtyard. Silence was her greatest weapon. By 11:30 p.m., 22 assassins lay unconscious or immobilized in the kill zones she had meticulously prepared. To the observers in the NIS surveillance van miles away, it looked like their men were simply vanishing into the shadows of the house. The tone shifted at midnight. The amateurs were gone, replaced by the sound of boots that moved with the synchronized rhythm of high-tier military training. Cadet felt a cold spark of recognition as she watched the thermal feed. They were using Spectre protocols, the same staggered entry and overlapping field of fire tactics she had helped write 10 years ago in a windowless room in Virginia. Her former unit had arrived to collect the bounty. There were 8 of them, led by a man named Vance, who still carried the scar on his neck from a mission they had barely survived together in Mogadishu. They bypassed her perimeter traps with surgical precision, knowing exactly where a ghost would hide a sensor. Cadet realized she couldn't use gadgetry against the men who knew her mind. She met them in the central gallery, beneath the watchful eyes of Hyungnim's ancestral portraits. "You're late, Vance," she said, her voice echoing through the hollow space. The Spectre team fanned out, but Cadet didn't wait for the engagement. She exploited the one thing they couldn't account for, her lack of a future. She moved with a suicidal fluidity, sliding beneath their line of fire and using a tactical strobe to blow out their high-end night vision. In the disorienting light, she dismantled them one by one, not as an enemy, but as a teacher correcting a flawed lesson. She broke wrists, shattered knees, and applied pressure point strikes that bypassed their heavy body armor. By the time Vance was the only one left standing, his unit lay around him in a circle of tactical failure. He looked at her, his breathing ragged, realizing that while they had been practicing the manual, Cadet had been living the nightmare. The final hour of the 10-hour siege felt like a fever dream of steel and shadow. The remaining elite masters, a Yakuza blade specialist and a Bratva enforcer, pushed into the inner sanctum where Hyungnim stood waiting, his executive calm finally showing cracks. Cadet engaged the Yakuza first, her leather jacket taking a shallow cut as she redirected his katana into the mahogany door frame, following up with a palm strike that ended his night. The Bratva enforcer was a wall of muscle, but Cadet used his own weight against him, a clinical throw that sent him through a glass partition. With the room cleared, the final shadow stepped forward from the corner, not an assassin, but Hyungnim's own nephew, Minsu, whom Cadet had supposedly neutralized in the boardroom. He held a detonator, his face twisted in a mask of patriotic betrayal. He had been the NIS's inside man all along, promising the throne once the Iron Dragon was slain. He looked at Cadet, screaming that she was a broken tool, a woman with nowhere to go. Cadet didn't argue. She didn't explain that her brokenness was exactly why she couldn't be bought. In a single, steady motion, she fired a non-lethal bolus from her sidearm, pinning Minsu to the wall before he could depress the trigger. As the sun began to bleed over the Seoul skyline, the 10 hours were up. 73 assassins lay broken across the estate. Hyungnim walked forward, his hand resting on Cadet's shoulder, a bridge between the old power and the new force. He offered her a permanent place, a seat at the table, and a life of luxury. Cadet looked at the blood on her boots and the quiet dawn. She had outrun her past for one more night. She declined the throne, choosing instead the freedom of the ghost she had become. She walked out the front gate just as she had walked in, alone, silent, and the only reason the Iron Dragon still breathed.